Hey everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Susie Park, and I am the Budget Director for the City of Chicago's Office of Budget and Management. Tonight, I am joined by Mayor Lightfoot to discuss the results from the public engagement efforts we have been working on over the last month. Thank you, Mayor, for being here with me tonight.
It's my pleasure. Good evening, everyone. First, let me thank our Budget Director, Susie Park, and the entire team in the Budget Office who've been working tirelessly now for months to make sure that we had a real plan going forward. And this engagement process is critically important to making sure that we form a budget that is responsive to the needs of residents in the city. As you know, we've engaged in countless town hall meetings. We have a survey which Susie will go over the results of, but it's really important that we hear from you. I announced on August 31st that we had an $800 million shortfall for 2020, and we were looking at a $1.2 billion deficit for 2021. Those are staggering numbers, most of which is attributable to COVID-19 impact on our economy. But we've been working diligently nonetheless. And as I said when I announced our budget deficit for next year, we are not going to abandon our values as we move through this budget process. The things that we've learned over these last 7 months related to COVID-19 tell us that we need to lean into our values around equity and inclusion and make sure that we are crafting a budget that not only sets us up to close our budget deficit, but sets us up and sets you up, our residents, for success going forward. We need to make sure that we continue to put our fiscal house in order, find structural solutions where we can, but do it in a way that is humane, that makes sure that we are continuing to fund the investments that we started in our 2020 budget, and that's what we intend to do moving forward. So I want to thank you all for participating, and I'll turn it back in this moment to Susie.
Thank you, Mayor. Since we released the budget forecast at the end of August, we have been listening to and reading all the feedback that we've received from our residents who participated in our engagement process, which included our survey, the Budget Week virtual town halls, and community roundtables. We will be releasing the full recap of our public engagement at chicago.gov/2021budget, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some of those results now. First, we opened our budget survey on August 31st. This was our second year for the survey, which more than 38,000 people completed. Last year, more than 7,300 people completed the survey as a comparison. Every residential zip code in the city was represented in the survey responses. However, 45% of responses were from the north side. This is definitely an area we want to continue to work on so we can make sure that we have a better distribution and representation of our survey across the entire city. When we compare survey results by area of the city, there are slight changes in the overall responses. However, generally the responses have similarities. All city areas ranked community services, including violence prevention, homeless support services, youth services as the highest priority, with police services as the lowest. All areas also indicated community services has the highest need for additional resources. While 4 city areas indicated police services had the lowest need for additional resources, the Loop and Southwest sides indicated regulatory services such as business licensing, building permits, and inspections had the lowest need for additional resources. For respondents who indicated that a reallocation of resources should be leveraged to other services, all areas selected police services as where those resources should be reallocated from. For the $1,000 budget allocation question that we asked in our survey, the average amount allocated for all areas was highest in community services, with the second highest average allocation for public health. The lowest average allocations for all areas were for regulatory services. We also hosted 5 virtual budget town halls from Monday, August 31st through Friday, September 4th, with each day covering a different topic. The virtual town halls received nearly 52,000 views, while also receiving 416 questions through our engagement website for commissioners to discuss. We also received 622 Facebook comments and questions. Over the week-long Facebook Live Budget Town Hall series, we addressed nearly 100 questions from the public and also provided information on various department budgets and operations. This year, for the first time, we also introduced a community roundtable series to solicit feedback for the 2021 budget. Residents hosted roundtable sessions to organize and facilitate conversations as budget ambassadors around the 2021 budget. We received more than 141 budget ambassador signups. 52 hosted a total of 66 community roundtables with more than 722 testimonies for the city to review. Participants in the roundtables represented nearly 50% of the zip codes in our city. Mayor, you and I had the opportunity to hear from some of the budget ambassadors over the last several weeks that held these roundtables, and I definitely very much appreciated hearing from everyone in the city about all the robust conversations that they were having around the budget. Were there any key takeaways that you had from what you heard from our ambassadors?
Well, first, let me thank all the people who took their time and resources to become budget ambassadors. This was a new concept that we rolled out this year, and I have to credit members of the engagement team led by Martina Hone, our new Chief Engagement Officer, who really drew from a wide cross-section of community members of the faith community, members of the healthcare community, community-based organizations, a real cross-section of Chicagoans from every neighborhood, and we got great feedback. There are a couple universal themes in those discussions. A lot of conversation around mental health and the need to make sure that we continue our commitment to community-based mental health options, particularly for our young people. Not surprisingly, also a lot of conversation around public safety and really reframing the conversation to think about what other resources could be brought online aside from the police department to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to build healthy, safe, and vibrant communities. And I mentioned mental health services for our youth, but there was also a lot of discussion about how can we make sure that we engage our young people, not just in their teenage years, but also early on in their lives to make sure that they understand that opportunity is at their fingertips. So these were fantastic conversations amongst the budget ambassadors, and they were reporting back out what they heard from you. So thank you again for those who participated in those very, very important discussions. And I know that we will be folding into our budget plan for 2021 a lot of the feedback that we heard through the Budget Ambassador Program.
Thank you, Mayor. And, I agree with your comments. And, I think in some of the conversations we had, I get asked a lot, like, are we really reading all of this feedback? And I think we can definitely assure everyone that we've heard, I've read all the comments, you've seen them. So, we do appreciate everyone that participated in that. All right, in that light, let's move to some resident questions. Like we mentioned, a lot of the feedback we received from both the roundtables and the surveys was around public safety. So let's start with a couple questions around that. We received a lot of responses related to defunding the police. Of more than the 19,000 comments we received on the survey, more than 18,000 of it mentioned the police. We received 158 questions for our town halls, also related to public safety. So I'll start with a couple questions around the city budgets for the police department, and there are two examples. Angela Fayed asks, how can CPD justify that a larger police force equals safer communities? I want data on how our tax dollars are being optimally spent, because it sure doesn't look that way. Also, how is CPD fulfilling our collective moral duty to keeping members of the community alive and healthy as they are making arrests or stopping people? Jack Newell asked, why is the CPD receiving close to $2 billion in funding? This is an institution responsible for millions of dollars in misconduct, lawsuit payments, which the city of Chicago has had to pay, as well as having a well-documented history of violence against Chicagoans, especially Black folks. Why does the CPD, an institution proven to be both a threat to public well-being and a financial drain on the city, need such immense funding when city social services and other essential city services, which keeps our neighborhoods safe and healthy, are chronically underfunded? So I think these are questions really wrapped around the police's budget. As I think we had talked about in one of the earlier town halls, it's about $1.7 billion of our corporate fund.
So let me kind of take these questions and break them apart into component parts. Obviously, the police budget is a substantial part of our corporate budget in the city of Chicago. We ended the law enforcement first and only strategy of public safety when I came into office. What we've focused on is the component parts that make up how do we build healthy and vibrant communities. And the police are an important part of it, but there's so much more. That's why we've done things like it had historic increases in funding for mental health, historic increases in focus on jobs and workforce development, affordable housing. What we're hearing from people, and I think this is really at the heart of a lot of the questions around how we're prioritizing funding law enforcement versus funding communities, is that communities have not gotten the kind of funding that they deserve to really make sure that they are moving in the right direction. And I agree with that 100%. That's why we've made our commitment to economic development and investing in neighborhoods south of Roosevelt Road and west of Ashland through programs like Invest Southwest, through initiatives like expanding the opportunities of neighborhood opportunity funds, building up support for our small businesses. All of these things we don't call them public safety, but they add up to making sure that residents feel like they're heard, that they have opportunities at their fingertips in their neighborhoods to fulfill their God-given talent, and that we are partnering with neighborhoods to come with resources in a different way than just simply funding the police department. And that is the spirit that we are taking into funding our budget for 2021 around public safety writ large. The public safety ecosystem is made up of a lot of component parts. Obviously, the police department is one part of it, but we also know that neighborhood-based organizations, street outreach, which we've made historic investments in, both in our 2020 budget and also through our CARES Act funding, these are all also important parts around public safety. The question, part of the question is, how do we hold police accountable? We've done, I think, a lot of progress. Obviously, the consent decree is our floor for doing just that, not the ceiling. But in addition, we really empowered our chief risk officer to look at police lawsuits. Police lawsuits, as many people know, the tally for that over the last 10 years has been $1 billion plus, but we weren't asking critical questions of what's going on in these lawsuits. Is it a problem of training, supervision, a problem officers? The kind of questions that you would expect us to ask weren't being asked, but they are now. And we've reduced the amount of money that we're paying out in settlements and judgments and attorney's fees. Now, we're not going to turn all of that around in one budget cycle or even two, but I think we've started to build the infrastructure we need to reduce those expenses, hold officers accountable, but also make sure that we are continuing to support the things that we know work in communities to keep our residents safe, and more to do.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so the next questions are around reallocating resources. So I think, a lot of the question is around the police budget, but also, how can we reallocate some of the resources around the city? So some of the questions are, Janelle Birchlove asks, we are faced with an unprecedented need for healthcare, mental health, housing, and other critical social services at this time. Why should the city continue to prioritize the police budget over these critical services? The city budget is zero-sum, and CPD makes up the largest share of the city's overall budget. What justification is there for the outsized spending relative to other critical services? Kyla Jarka also asks, why do we keep funneling over $1 billion into CPD when it is clear that CPD is not preventing violence or crime in our city? Why don't we prioritize funding services that have proven to reduce crime?
So let me push back a little bit on the premise of both of the questions. We don't prioritize funding for the police department over other necessary services that really build healthy and strong communities. As I mentioned before, we've made historic investments in mental health, in affordable housing, in homelessness prevention, and to the extent that we can continue to prioritize those in funding at the same level, we're going to. we're in a very difficult time. As you know, we've had significant impact on city revenues for this year and for next year as a result of COVID-19. Of our $1.2 billion deficit for next year, over 65% of that is directly related to COVID-19 impacts. So a lot of hard choices are going to have to be made, but we will not abandon our values. We will continue to fund the services that we know are critically important to building a healthy and safe Chicago. And that includes mental health funding. That includes funding for affordable housing. That includes making sure that we continue to work on homelessness prevention. But it also means that we have to keep pressing the federal government to step up and do its fair share to help cities like Chicago. And we hope that before the federal government, and particularly the House and the Senate, recess for the election, that they will come through with the funding that we all need to make sure that we can address and respond to the needs of our city. If that doesn't happen, and we have to go it alone without continued support from the federal government, unfortunately, we are going to have to make a lot of tough and hard choices. I'm hoping that the consciousness of members of the House and Senate is pricked and that they will do the right thing and provide funding. But if they don't, we've been working on a number of different scenarios to make sure that we deliver for residents of our city. But obviously, we have to do it with the consciousness that we have dire fiscal circumstances that we are facing both this year and next.
Okay, we've also received lots of questions related to police reform. Here are just a few. Eva Murillo asks, how does Mayor Lightfoot plan to hold police accountable for violence when the budget for community policing under the Civilian Office of Police Accountability only receives 0.8% of the funding that the Chicago Police Department receives? Anonymous asks, are there tools in the budget process that could strengthen Chicago's negotiation position with the police union? Specifically, how can Chicago make progress on the Nix the Six proposal? And Natalie Nispoli-Morera asks, 70% of the consent decree deadlines have not been met. What can you do now as mayor to put pressure on the CPD to comply with the consent decree? Do you agree that passing CPAC would relieve some of your own pressure to see these through? If there was community control, would you not have relief in your own duties and create trust and transparency in community police relations?
Well, let me talk about CPAC. I don't support it, and I've been very clear on that since CPAC really came into fashion. I absolutely support civilian oversight of the police, and we are working on trying to get to a proposal that we can get to City Council and get it passed as soon as possible so it can go into effect. Police accountability is an issue that I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. As many of you know, not only was I the president of the Chicago Police Board, but I was also the leader of the Police Accountability Task Force, where we laid out a very specific blueprint on police accountability. Many of those measures are baked into the consent decree. And you're right, over the last 2 years, and particularly since before I became mayor, CPD did not carry its weight in meeting the consent decree mandates. I've made it very clear to Superintendent Brown and all that are involved in the constitutional policing side of the House at CPD that continued delay and failure to meet deadlines simply isn't going to be acceptable. We put a number of measures in place, and they've been in place now for several months, to make sure that we do meet our consent decree deadlines. But as the superintendent himself has said, and I agree, the consent decree is merely a floor, not a ceiling. There's much more that we need to do to hold ourselves accountable and to make sure that the reforms that are necessary to build legitimacy between the police and the community are in place. That's why, for example, Superintendent Brown has made sure that many more officers are involved on a weekly basis in community service projects. If the community doesn't know the officers are in their community, they're never going to trust them. They're never going to be able to build legitimacy. And we're breaking down those barriers on a daily basis to make sure that that happens. building trusting, constitutional, authentic relationships between line police officers and the community members that they are sworn to serve is critically important and their most important tool. And we will keep building on the measures that are already in place and really being driven by community members themselves to bridge that divide between the police and the community. And so we keep working on those issues, but we also need you to be part of the solutions. Yes, this is a challenging time in our city. Yes, there have been instances where police have crossed the line, and every single one of them, we have made sure that there's accountability, and we worked hard to strengthen COPA, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and they are working vigorously to make sure that they get the cases thoroughly investigated and get to a result, and make sure that there's transparency all the way along that journey, and certainly with the victims who've made allegations of police misconduct. But we also need to make sure that we are strengthening the ability for our police officers to be able to do their job. And part of that is really having the conversation that we're having right now around what is the proper role of the police. We have reflexively answered that as the police are the cure-all for all the community needs, and we know that that's absolutely not correct. So one of the things that we will be announcing in the coming days is a pilot to move from the police being the first and only responders to a process by which we identify areas where others can step up and take the lead on issues responding to the community's needs. And we'll be talking more about that in the coming days.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so central to the public safety conversation is also violence prevention. Here are some questions we received. Eddie Bocanegra asks, how can the city be more efficient with other city departments to help reduce violence? In addition, what metrics are we using to justify the dollars that go into our police and community interventions? Tina Figueroa also asks, how can we make sure that violence prevention and rehabilitative justice gets proper funding as opposed to police who take up 40% of the city's budget and do nothing to solve the root causes of crime? And as a follow-up, how will you ensure that divested communities who have been doing 99% of the work in crime prevention through non-carceral solutions have an influential voice in the allocation of these funds?
Well, I have to say, Tina and Eddie, thank you both for your questions. But to suggest that the police do nothing to help solve the root causes of crime, it's just misplaced. It's not accurate, and I can't support that assumption. But what we do is, and what we've been doing since I took office, is really an all-hands-on-deck approach to public safety. I mentioned before the ecosystem of public safety. And so we have, obviously, the law enforcement has a role to play, but there are a number of other organizations, and Eddie, you belong to one of them, that has a role to play. Street intervention, community-based organizations that help support women and children and families. All of those elements are part of the ecosystem of public safety. And while they may not directly think of themselves as being on the front lines of public safety, whenever you're building healthy, strong, and vibrant communities and supporting individuals in their desire for good jobs, in their desire for affordable housing, in their desire to really live their lives in peace and providing those kinds of community supports and interventions, you are part of that public safety ecosystem, and we are funding those kinds of organizations and those kinds of interventions as we have been for a number of years. I convened during the transition in April of 2019 the first ever public safety cabinet, where we were bringing together not just the police, but the libraries, the schools, the parks, public health department, the Department of Family and Support Services, and our infrastructure departments, all together to be thinking about public safety from a lot of different angles and perspective. And we continue that work together. And we have seen a number of specific results. We are focused on those those areas in our city that really are plagued by violence based upon data-driven metrics. And every time that we convene the Public Safety Cabinet, we ask ourselves the questions, what can we do more in these areas of our city that are most in need? That is the holistic approach that we have taken to public safety from day one. Now, we've had challenges this year, but let's not forget, we ended last year, 2019, under 500 homicides for the first time in a very long time. Now, we've seen a reversal in our fortunes this year, but a lot of that, too, is attributable to COVID-19. And let me tell you why I think that's so. In this ecosystem where we rely upon law enforcement, local, state, and federal, the courts, the prosecutors, but the other elements of it that are community-based, every aspect of the public safety ecosystem has been dramatically impacted by COVID-19. Literally, where institutions, organizations stopped providing services during March and April, and to some extent May, and many of those services didn't come back online until July. So we're starting to see some progress, but it's been hard pressed. And meanwhile, unfortunately, as those services that we depend upon to really help suppress the violence, mitigate the retaliatory shootings, weren't online, the violence raged. Not only here in Chicago, but in other cities across the country, like New York, like Los Angeles, like St. Louis, and Baltimore. Now, we're all getting back on our footing, but we've got to dig down harder, particularly here in Chicago, to finish the year strong and make sure that everyone in this all-hands-on-deck strategy has the support and resources that they need to be successful in their core mission. And we at the city are committed to making sure that that happens and that partnership, those authentic partnerships, remain strong.
Okay, let's change lanes a little bit and we'll move on to human services, which is another big theme that we've heard through all of our outreach. This includes public health, homeless services, services to seniors, workforce services, youth service, violence prevention, and services to people with disabilities, to name a few. We received many questions about homelessness as well. Here are a few. Nancy Turner asks, what is the city doing to support youth who are homeless? And Ishmael Enriquez asks, how can you provide a decent home to homeless people?
Well, we've spent a significant amount of our city resources in homelessness prevention. And in particular, in our response to COVID-19, one of the areas that we place early emphasis is on homelessness. We did a lot to make sure that we decompressed our homeless shelters so that our homelessness shelters would not become COVID hotspots. And we had a lot of success in really keeping down the number of cases and deaths in our homeless shelters and in our homeless population in general. The CARES Act money that we received, tens of millions of dollars went into homelessness prevention, as well as supporting our shelter system and doing outreach as we normally do to make sure that people that are living on the streets have real options, and that for those who choose to remain, that we continue to engage with them to provide them supports that they need, from mental health services to food, of course, and also then trying to get them transition into temporary and then permanent housing. That work continues, but the city has made, again, significant investments just in the 2020 budget and again through our CARES Act funding to help support the ongoing work of preventing homelessness and addressing those who are living not just on the streets, but are themselves housing insecure. I have to credit our Department of Housing. I also have to credit our Department of Families and Support Services, who really take the lead with the city and addressing these issues, as well as our Department of Public Health that also provides supports around mental health and addiction. That is also an issue that plagues many of the people who find themselves homeless. And we will continue to support those efforts.
Both through last year's public engagement around the budget and this year, we received many comments related to mental health. In this year's budget, we invested an additional $9.3 million in mental health, and mental health was mentioned by participants in our focus groups at least 23 times when asked what services needed additional resources. That said, here are some of the questions and comments we received around mental health. Letitia Diaz asks, with the detrimental effects of the pandemic, how will you fund the mental health of communities that were already marginalized by the system? And then Anonymous asks, there has been an increase in homelessness and unemployment. Because of this and the pandemic in general, our fellow Chicagoans are struggling with mental health. This is why community services have become more important than ever.
I'm going to take you back to the fall of 2019, where we announced a whole new framework emphasizing community-based resources to address mental health, trauma, and a range of other issues related to mental health. We made those investments a year ago. We doubled down on those investments again using CARES Act funding, and we will continue to live up to the commitment that we made. We know that this is a difficult time. People are suffering trauma. We see that in the calls for services to the various helplines that are funded and supported by the city. We know that through the work that our recovery task force did to make sure that we become a very trauma-informed city with services that are available at the community-based level. And through the time of the pandemic, we placed a lot of emphasis on telehealth mental health services as well. So we understand that there's a great need. We've heard that over and over again. I mentioned that this was one of the consistent themes that we heard from our budget ambassadors, and we are committed to making sure that we address the trauma that many are experiencing. One of the other pieces of this that's not embedded in these two questions, but is equally important, is a real spike in overdoses in Chicago that has devastated a number of communities and unfortunately resulted in a huge number of deaths. So we are focused on all of these issues that really emanate and fall in the umbrella of mental health, and particularly as it affects our young people.
We already talked a bit about violence prevention, and our Human Services Department plays a key role in violence prevention, which we discussed during our virtual town hall with our commissioners. Here is one question related to this topic. Rachel McDonald asks, on the topic of violence prevention, I believe the most effective models have shown that an increase in human services leads to a decrease in violence and recidivism. Will you commit to shifting funds from the public safety section of the budget to the human services section to ensure that youth services, homeless support, mental health care, and workforce development do not see any austerity cuts during this difficult financial period? This is what citizens across the city have been requesting in the streets, in messages to our aldermen, and in pleas to the mayor's office. Our human services are already drastically underfunded. They should not be subject to any austerity measures at this time. They are more essential than ever.
Rachel, thank you for your question, and thank you for your passion around this issue, which is obvious from your questions here. Obviously, as we've been talking about, we recognize this is a great need to make sure that we continue to live our values through our support and funding of human resources. And I don't think that this is an either or choice. I think it's a both. We must continue to support youth services, homelessness, mental health, and workforce development. If you look at the way in which we utilize our CARES Act funding, all of these programmatic initiatives and more were funded. We are going to continue to do as good as we can under the circumstances that we face, which is a $1.2 billion budget deficit, but we're not going to abandon our values. And we know that there's a great need in our community for these kinds of services, and we're going to think creatively about ways that we can continue to provide resources in these areas of need across our city.
During Budget Week, we covered a wide range of topics related to infrastructure, from recycling to bike lanes to the city's sewer system. We received lots of questions and comments regarding the equitable distribution of services and residents wanting to make sure the most effective and efficient services are delivered in their communities. Here is an example of one question. Flor Rodriguez asks, how would funds be distributed equitably among neighborhoods that have been neglected for many years? My neighborhood needs roads to be fixed, new streetlights, sanitation, cleanup, and graffiti removal.
Well, Flora, thank you for your question. I'm going to ask you to email me at lori.lightfoot@cityofchicago.org to provide me with more specific information about where you live so we can make sure that we address some of these immediate needs that you've identified. But what I'll tell you is we've been working on this whole notion of equity and inclusion and making sure that we see neighborhoods beyond the Central Business District, River North, and the South Loop and the West Loop. That is an emphasis that we place on prioritizing investments, particularly in the kind of infrastructure needs that you've identified, and we will continue to do just that.
Commissioner Connor, when he was here for Facebook Live, previewed the Department of Water Management's lead service line replacement program during our virtual town hall. And since then, the Equity Focus program was announced. Can you tell us a little more about the goals of this program?
Yes. First and foremost, as many of you know, the City of Chicago required lead service lines up until 1986. That put our city in a very difficult situation, as we now know that we need to remove those lead service lines. The estimate for doing so on a citywide basis is $8.5 billion. Now, obviously, given our financial straits that we find ourselves in last year, this year, and in the future years, we don't have $8.5 billion, but we have to start somewhere. That's why we announced a pilot program, and we are going to provide discounted and free lead service line replacement for communities and for residents that fall within a certain income criteria. We're also going to launch a pilot program alongside the water main replacement program so we can see the kind of construction that works and how to do it most efficiently. And then we're going to keep lobbying both Springfield and the federal government to provide additional resources so we can start to dismantle the lead service lines in our city on a yearly basis. So this is just a start, not a finish, but I'm enthusiastic about actually starting the hard work that should have started years ago, not kicking the can down the road any further.
During our Neighborhood and Economic Development Town Hall, Commissioner Cox talked about the comprehensive citywide planning process that the Department of Planning and Development is undertaking. Here is a question we received about this from Valerie Leonard. I understand Chicago will be undergoing a comprehensive planning process for the entire city. What mechanisms will be put into place to ensure authentic input and engagement from rank and file citizens, in addition to the usual suspects that include institutions and more established nonprofits?
Thank you, Valerie, for the question. And let me give a little more context. The City of Chicago has not had a comprehensive land use plan since 1966. What has that meant for our city? That means that how and where and under what circumstances development happens is really left to the vagaries of developers and the occasional efforts of aldermen who work hard to bring economic development to their neighborhoods. But in the absence of a comprehensive plan, many neighborhoods have been neglected and left behind. So part of the emphasis on a citywide plan and making sure that we get valuable input, as you say, from rank and file ordinary citizens, is that we want to make sure that we are protecting the integrity of neighborhoods, that we are making sure that evolving neighborhoods, development, doesn't mean displacement for long-term residents. The only way we can get to that point is making sure that we have a thoughtful, comprehensive plan that reflects the experience and the aspirations of individual residents, and that's what we intend to do. The Department of Planning and Development, under the leadership of Commissioner Cox, I think has already established a well-earned track record of making sure that we have thoughtful engagement so that residents are co-curating their future and their vision for their neighborhoods. We've seen that happen in programs like Invest Southwest, and we're going to take the tools that have been gleaned through that process and use them to have a robust public engagement process for the development of this new citywide plan that we expect will be in place for decades to come. That's why we need your help and your participation.
Support for businesses, especially during the pandemic, was an area we also covered during our virtual town hall. A couple questions we received related to this. Jonathan Schneider asked, given the challenges faced by the small business community and the need for supports for high-quality, family-sustaining job opportunities, will the city commit to fully funding or even expanding the Neighborhood Business Development Center? Lois White also asks, with all of the vacant lots and vacant storefronts, can grants be given to small existing businesses and entrepreneurs willing to start new businesses to stop the blight and create a thriving community atmosphere?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Lois. Both great questions. Let's give you a little bit of context. As a result of the significant impact that COVID-19 has had on all kinds of businesses, particularly our small and micro businesses, we invested approximately $150 million just this year to support our small businesses. If you compare what's been done by New York or LA, we've done 3 times as much as those cities in supporting our small business community, and more to come. I have to give credit to our outstanding Commissioner of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection, Rosa Escareno. She and her team have been working diligently over these many months to make sure that small businesses are not left behind. They've engaged with individual businesses through chambers of commerce, through industry organizations, to make sure that small businesses have a seat at the table, both as part of our COVID response, but also as we plan for our recovery post-COVID. So we've done a lot to make sure that we continue to engage. And there's a question about the neighborhood business development centers. We've used those centers and pushed them to make sure that they're providing technical assistance to small businesses in need, that they are using their reach into neighborhoods to provide us with feedback on what the experiences are of the small business community. And we think that that's been a successful partnership, but we will continue to make sure that we fully support those neighborhood business development centers, but also hold them accountable to really provide the support that is necessary to small businesses all across the city. Lois asked a question about vacant storefronts. There was a quirk in the property assessment rules that actually incentivize store owners to keep those storefronts vacant, if you can believe that. So for over a year, we've been working with the assessor, Fritz Kagi, and his team to change that around so that if you've got a vacant store, you're not incentivized to keep it vacant. We want to make sure that those commercial properties and those areas are actually vibrant with new businesses coming in that really want to make a commitment to the neighborhoods in which they're investing. And we're continuing to make sure that we look for opportunities to spur economic development, particularly on the part of small and micro businesses. Micro businesses are those that employ 4 employees or less. Those are the heart of our neighborhoods. They hire from the neighborhoods. They provide stability in those neighborhoods, and we've got to do everything that we can to support them.
Affordable housing and protection for renters and homeowners throughout the pandemic has also been a key issue the city is working through. We allocated more than $26 million for housing assistance during the pandemic, but I know affordable housing is an issue that transcends COVID-19. In the 2020 budget, we did include an additional $10 million for affordable housing, and during our virtual town halls, we discussed how the Department of Housing's nearly $200 million budget is comprised primarily of funding for the construction of new affordable housing and preservation of existing affordable housing. That said, we know more needs to be done. One example of a question received from one of our budget ambassadors is, I want to know why affordable housing is not being funded, why communities aren't being funded for services needed in the community. Mayor, can you talk a little bit about your plan for continuing to support and expand affordable housing initiatives?
Well, as you saw from you stated, we've spent a significant amount of city resources, CARES Act funding, and other resources to make sure that we are addressing the affordable housing crisis that has existed in our city for far too long. And we will continue to support and look for ways in which we can reduce that deficit in affordable housing. One of the things that we've recently brought online is our Equitable transit-oriented development program. Now, we've had transit-oriented development for a long time, but it hasn't been viewed through an equity lens. And that means making sure that people living in neighborhoods can stay in neighborhoods, making sure that these developments aren't just studio apartments, 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms, but having apartments that actually can accommodate families, and particularly multi-generational families. That is what we mean when we talk about equitable transit-oriented development. And that's just one example on top of the others that you've mentioned, a way where we're trying to chip away at the affordable housing crisis that has been existent in the city for far too long.
So we have some more questions that we received from our budget ambassadors. So this next one is, while we understand we are a city of neighborhoods, West Side, South Side, and North Side, how can we get Chicago to work together as one community? And how can we be fairer in the distribution of resources to every resident?
Well, that's a great question, and I agree with the sentiment. We will only get through this moment together if we think of ourselves as neighbors, not 77 different little fragmented pieces, but the city as a whole. Now, the 77 neighborhoods are a great strength. There's a mosaic. We have people from all over the world who now call Chicago home. We have people who are born and raised in Chicago. But one of the things that I think has been a great strength of the city through the pandemic is seeing how people all over the city have really stepped up to help their neighbors, and oftentimes in instances where they'll never know who is actually the beneficiary of their good works. I think about going to some of the pop-up food pantries that have been put up, and you think about people packing these boxes with food stuff that are going off to be distributed to people in various parts of the city that are in need. Those are packages of love packed by individuals who are stepping up in big ways and small and saying, how can I help? And then answering that question by stepping up. And that's just one example. But we've got to think of ourselves as neighbors. We've got to think about ourselves as Chicagoans with a shared future, a shared destiny. In this time, too often we talk past each other. And too often the civic discussion is very toxic. We've got to think about ways in which we can build bridges over which people who may be different than us, may have a different background and a different perspective, can come to us and we to them. That is the only way that I know that we're going to be able to get through this very difficult time, is together and uniting as Chicagoans.
Thank you, Mayor. We are waiting for our next question. Okay. Another question from one of our budget ambassadors. We are curious about resources being allocated to make sure that those in Black and Brown communities are able to vote. Would like to see a budget of at least $3 million in education around voting.
Now, a couple of things I think this question. First of all, great question, and I just want to emphasize, early voting has started. Make sure that you have a plan. If you're going to request a mail-in ballot, no time like the president to do that. Make sure that your ballot is postmarked before November 3rd. And all early voting sites will have secured boxes for you to take your mail-in ballot to if you're worried about whether or not it will get there in time through the Postal Service. Now, in Chicago, the Chicago Board of Election is an independent entity. It sits outside of city government. Nonetheless, we have been working diligently with the Board of Election to provide them the support that they need to make sure that people get the word out about where they need to vote, how they can vote, make a plan to vote, and we're going to be using city resources to do that as well. In addition, we want to make sure that the election process has integrity. That the election sites themselves, the polling places, are secure and they are safe, and that is part of our engagement with the Chicago Board of Elections, which again is an independent entity. The challenge that I have given to the Chicago Board of Elections is to make sure that they have enough resources for polling places, polling judges, election judges, and importantly, the people who are going to be necessary to count those mail-in ballots on Election Day as the polls close. I am confident that we will be able to make sure to support the Chicago Board of Elections so we have a good, safe election that has integrity, and so that we can get your votes counted as expeditiously as possible.
Our last question is, we kicked off our public engagement process with the release of the 2021 budget forecast, which, as you mentioned earlier, projected a $1.2 billion gap for the 2021 budget. We have been working hard to identify ways to close this gap while balancing the need to preserve key city services. As we saw, most respondents on our survey did not want the city to increase revenue, but they also want more investments in community services and public health, which are difficult to balance with more than a $1 billion gap. We have said nothing is off the table, and all departments have been asked to find efficiencies and savings, including the police department, but these savings right now are going towards closing our gap. Can we talk a little bit how the public engagement feedback is helping to inform the choices being made and how you see balancing these different priorities?
Well, look, it's critically important. We are a city government that is intended to serve the people. So we have to hear from you in order to understand how we should prioritize spending your tax dollars. So this engagement that we've had, which has really been historic in the number of people who have weighed in through the Facebook town halls, through the Budget Ambassador Program, through the survey that far exceeded the numbers even from last year. We've had a significant amount of engagement, and we want to keep hearing from you. We will not be releasing our final budget for some weeks now, so keep the comments coming. But your engagement matters to us, and absolutely we will be folded into and part of our considerations as we make a series of tough choices in a tough budget environment. But I appreciate all the passion. I appreciate you spending your time with us, getting yourself informed, and we will keep pushing information out to you as we head towards the process of presenting a budget, a balanced budget, to the City Council in October. Thank you very much for everything that you've done, and keep providing us with information.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.